Last Battle by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 1. By Cauldron Pool. In the last days of Narnia, far up to the west, beyond Lantern Waste, and close beside the great waterfall, there lived an ape. He was so old that no one could remember when he'd first come to live in those parts, and he was the cleverest, ugliest, most wrinkled ape you can imagine. He had a little house built of wood and thatched with leaves, up in the fork of a great tree, and his name was Shift. There were very few talking beasts, or men, or dwarfs, or people of any sort in that part of the wood, but Shift had one friend and neighbour, who was a donkey called Puzzle. At least, they both said they were friends, but from the way things went on, you might have thought Puzzle was more like Shift's servant than his friend. He did all the work. When they went together to the river, Shift filled the big skin bottles with water, but it was Puzzle who carried them back. When they wanted anything from the towns farther down the river, it was Puzzle who went down with empty panniers on his back and came back with the panniers full and heavy. And all the nicest things that Puzzle brought back were eaten by Shift. For, as Shift said, "You see, Puzzle, I can't eat grass and thistles like you, so it's only fair I should make it up in other ways."
"Of course, Shift, yes, I see that."
Puzzle never complained, because he knew that Shift was far cleverer than himself, and he thought it very kind of Shift to be friends with him at all. And if Puzzle did ever try to argue about anything, Shift would always say, "Now, Puzzle, I understand what needs to be done better than you. You know you're not clever, Puzzle."
"No, Shift, it's quite true I'm not clever."
Then he would sigh and do whatever Shift had said. One morning, early in the year, the pair of them were out walking along the shore of Cauldron Pool. Cauldron Pool is the big pool right under the cliffs at the western end of Narnia. The great waterfall pours down into it with a noise like everlasting thunder, and the river of Narnia flows out on the other side. The waterfall keeps the pool always dancing and bubbling and churning round and round as if it were on boil, and that's of course how it got its name, Cauldron Pool. It's the liveliest in the early spring, when the waterfall is swollen with all the snow that's melted off the mountains from up beyond Narnia in the Western Wild. That's from where the river comes. And as they looked at Cauldron Pool, Shift suddenly pointed with his dark, skinny finger and said, "Look! What's that?"
"What's what?"
"That yellow thing there, just come down the waterfall. Look, there it is again. It's floating. We must find out what it is."
"Must we?"
"Of course we must. It may be something useful. Just hop into the pool like a good fellow and fish it out. Then we can have a proper look at it."
"Hop into the pool?" said Puzzle, twitching his long ears.
"Well, how are we to get it if you don't?"
"But wouldn't it be better if you went in? You see, it's you who wants to know what it is, and I don't much, and you've got hands, you see. You're as good as a man or a dwarf when it comes to catching hold of things. I've only got hoofs."
"Really, Puzzle? I didn't think you'd say a thing like that. I didn't think it of you, really."
"Why, what have I said wrong?" said the ass, speaking in rather a humble voice, for he saw that Shift was very deeply offended. "All I meant was—"
"Wanting me to go into the water? As if you didn't know perfectly well what weak chests apes always have, and how easily they catch cold. Oh, very well, I will go in. Oh, I'm feeling cold enough already in this cruel wind. But I'll go in. I shall probably die. Then you'll be sorry." Shift's voice sounded as if he were about to burst into tears.
"Please don't, please don't, please don't. I never meant anything of the sort, Shift, really I didn't. You know how stupid I am. I can't think of more than one thing at a time. I'd forgotten about your weak chest. Of course I'll go in. You mustn't think of doing it yourself. Promise me you won't, Shift."
So Shift promised, and Puzzle went cloppity-clop on his four hoofs round the rocky edge of the pool to find a place where he could get in. Quite apart from the cold, it was no joke getting into the quivering, foaming water. Puzzle had to stand and shiver for a whole minute before he made up his mind to do it. But then, as Shift called out from behind him and said, "Perhaps I'd better do it after all, Puzzle."
No, you promised." "I'm in now." And in he went.
A great mass of foam got him in the face and filled his mouth with water and blinded him. Then he went under altogether for a few seconds, and when he came up again he was in quite a different part of the pool. Then the swirl caught him and carried him round and round, faster and faster, till it took him right under the waterfall itself, and the force of the water plunged him down, deep down, so he thought he'd never get hold of his breath again. And then, when he did come up, when at last he got somewhere near the thing he was trying to catch, it sailed away from him till it too got under the fall and was forced down to the bottom. When it came up again it was farther from him than ever, but at last, when he was almost tired to death, and bruised all over and numb with cold, he succeeded in gripping the thing with his teeth, and out he came, carrying it in front of him and getting his front hoofs tangled up in it, for it was as big as a large hearthrug, and very heavy and cold and slimy. He flung it down in front of Shift and stood dripping and shivering and trying to get his breath back. But the ape never looked at him or asked how he felt. The ape was far too busy going round and round the thing, and spreading it out, and patting it and smelling it. Then a wicked gleam came into his eye. "It's a lion's skin."
Oh, is it?
Now, I wonder
who killed the poor lion. It ought to be buried. We should have a funeral.
It wasn't a talking lion, you needn't bother about that. There are no talking beasts up beyond the falls, not up in the western wild. The skin must have belonged to a dumb wild animal. This, by the way, was true. A hunter, a man, had killed and skinned the lion somewhere up in the western wild several months before, but that doesn't come into this story.
All the same, Shift, even if the skin only belonged to a dumb wild lion, oughtn't we to give it a decent burial? I mean, aren't all lions rather solemn because of you-know-who, don't you see?
Don't start getting ideas into your head, Puzzle, because you know thinking isn't your strong point. We'll make the skin into a fine, warm winter coat for you.
No, I don't think I'd like that. It would look... the other beasts, they might think... I should feel...
What are you talking about? Said Shift, scratching himself the wrong way up, as apes do.
I don't think it would be respectful to the great lion, to Aslan himself, if an ass like me went about dressed up in a lion's skin.
Now don't stand there arguing, please. What does an ass like you know about things of that sort? You know you're not good at thinking, Puzzle, so why don't you let me do your thinking for you? Why don't you treat me as I treat you? I don't think I can do everything. I know you're better at some things than I am. That's why I let you go into the pool. I knew you'd do it better than me. And why can't I have my turn when it comes to something I can do and you can't? Am I never to be allowed to do anything? Oh, do be fair. Turn and turn about.
Oh, well, of course, if you put it that way.
I tell you what, you'd better take a good brisk trot down river as far as Chippingford, and see if they've got any oranges or bananas.
But I'm so tired, Shift.
Yes, but you're very cold and wet. You want something to warm you up. A brisk trot will be just the thing. Besides, it's market day at Chippingford today. Then, of course, Puzzle said he would go. And as soon as he was alone, Shift went shambling along, sometimes on 2 paws and sometimes on 4, till he reached his own tree. Then he swung himself up from branch to branch, chattering and grinning all the time, and went into his little house. He found needle and thread and a big pair of scissors there, for he was a clever ape, and the dwarfs had taught him how to sew. He put the ball of thread, it was very thick stuff, more like cord than thread, into his mouth, so that his cheek bulged out as if he was sucking a great big bit of toffee. He then held the needle between his lips and took the scissors in his left paw. Then he came down the tree and shambled across to the lion's skin. He squatted down and got to work. He saw at once that the body of a lion's skin would be too long for Puzzle and its neck too short, so he cut a good piece out of the body and used it to make a long collar for Puzzle's long neck. Then he cut off the head and sewed the collar in between the head and the shoulders. He then put threads on both sides of the skin, so that it would tie up under Puzzle's chest and stomach. Every now and then a bird would pass overhead, and Shift would stop his work, looking anxiously up. He did not want anyone to see what he was doing, but none of the birds he saw were talking birds, so it didn't matter. Late in the afternoon Puzzle came back. He was not trotting, but only plodding patiently along, the way donkeys do.
There weren't any oranges, and there weren't any bananas, and I'm very tired."
He lay down.
"Come and try on your beautiful new lion skin coat."
"Oh, bother that old skin. I'll try it on in the morning. I'm too tired tonight."
"You are unkind, Puzzle. If you're tired, what do you think I am? All day long, while you've been having a lovely, refreshing walk down the valley, I've been working hard to make you a coat. My paws are so tired I can hardly hold these scissors. And now you won't say thank you, and you won't even look at the coat. And you don't care. And oh, Shift, I'm sorry. I'm horrid. Of course I'd love to try it on. It looks simply splendid. Do try it on me at once. Please do." "Well, stand still then." The skin was very heavy for the ape to lift, but in the end, with a lot of pulling and pushing and puffing and blowing, he got it onto the donkey. He tied it underneath Puzzle's body, and he tied the legs to Puzzle's legs, and the tail to Puzzle's tail. A good deal of Puzzle's grey nose and face could still be seen through the open mouth of the lion's head. No one who had ever seen a real lion would have been taken in for a moment. But if someone who had never seen a lion looked at Puzzle in his lion skin, he might just mistake him for a lion, if he didn't come too close, and if the light was not too good, and if Puzzle didn't let out a bray, and didn't make any noise with his hoofs. "You look wonderful, wonderful. If anyone saw you now, they'd think you were Aslan, the great lion himself."
"Well, that would be dreadful."
"No, it wouldn't. Everyone would do whatever you told them."
"Well, I don't want to tell them anything."
"But think of the good we could do. You'd have me to advise you, you know. I'd think of sensible orders for you to give, and everyone would have to obey us, even the king himself. We would set everything right in Narnia."
"Isn't everything right already?"
"What? Everything right? When there are no oranges or bananas?"
"Well, you know, there aren't many people, in fact I don't think there's anyone but yourself, who wants those sort of things."
"There's sugar, too."
"Oh, yes. It would be nice if there was more sugar."
"Well, then, that's settled. You'll pretend to be Aslan, and I'll tell you what to say."
"No, no, no! Don't say such dreadful things. It'll be wrong, Shift. I may not be clever, but I know that much. What would become of us if a real Aslan turned up?"
"I expect he'd be very pleased. He'd probably sent that lion skin on purpose, so that we would set things right. Anyway, he never does turn up. Not nowadays."
At that moment there came a great thunderclap right overhead, and the ground trembled with a small earthquake. Both the animals lost their balance and were flung on their faces.
"There!"
gasped Puzzle as soon as he had breath to speak.
"It's a sign, a warning. I knew we were doing something dreadfully wicked. Take this wretched skin off me at once."
"No, no," said the ape, whose mind worked very quickly. "It's a sign the other way. I was just going to say that if a real Aslan, as you call him, meant us to go on with this, he would send us a thunderclap or an earth tremor. It was just on the tip of my tongue, only the sign came before I could get the words out. Oh, well, you've got to do it now, Puzzle. And please do not let us have any more arguing. You know you don't understand these things. What could a donkey know about signs?" Chapter 2. The Rashness of the King. About 3 weeks later, the last of the kings of Narnia sat under the great oak which grew beside the door of his little hunting lodge. He often stayed there for 10 or so days in the pleasant spring weather. It was a low thatched building not far from the eastern end of Lantern Waste, and some way above a meeting of the two rivers. He loved to live there, simply and at ease, away from the state and pomp of Cair Paravel, the royal city. His name was King Tirian, and he was between 20 and 25 years old. His shoulders were already broad and strong, and his limbs were full of hard muscle, but his beard was still scanty. He had blue eyes and a fearless, honest face. There was no one with him that spring morning except his dearest friend, Jewel the unicorn. They loved each other like brothers, and each had saved the other's life in the wars. The lordly beast stood close beside the king's chair, with its neck bent round, polishing its blue horn against the creamy whiteness of its flank. I cannot set myself to do any work today, Jewel. I can think of nothing but this wonderful news. Think you we shall hear more of it today? They are the most wonderful tidings ever heard in our days, or our fathers', or our grandfathers' days, sire, if they are true.
How can they choose but be true? It's more than a week ago the first birds came flying over us, saying Aslan is here, Aslan has come to Narnia again, and then the squirrels. They'd not seen him, but they said it was certain he was in the woods. Then came the stag. He had seen him with his own eyes, a great way off, by moonlight in Lantern Waste. Then came that dark man with a beard, the merchant from Calormen. The Calormens care nothing for Aslan as we do, but the man spoke of it as a thing beyond doubt. And there was the badger last night. He too had seen Aslan. Indeed, sire, I believe it all. If I seem not to, it is only that my joy is too great to let my belief settle itself. It's almost too beautiful to believe. Yes. Yes, said the king with a great sigh, almost a shiver of delight. It is beyond all that I ever hoped for in all my life. Listen, said Jewel, putting his head on one side and cocking his ears forward. What is it? Hoofs, sire, a galloping horse, a very heavy horse. It must be one of the centaurs. Look, here he is. A great golden-bearded centaur, with man's sweat on his forehead and horse's sweat on his chestnut flanks, dashed up to the king, stopped, and bowed low.
Hail, king.
Ho there, said the king, looking over his shoulder towards the door of the hunting lodge. A bowl of wine for the noble centaur. Welcome, Runwit. When you have found your breath, you shall tell us your errand. A page came out of the house, carrying a great wooden bowl, curiously carved, and handed it to the centaur. The centaur raised the bowl and said,
I drink first to Aslan and truth, sire, and secondly to your majesty.
He finished the wine, enough for 6 strong men, at one draught, and handed the empty bowl back to the page. Now, Runwit, do you bring us more news of Aslan? Runwit looked very grave, frowning a little.
Sire, you know how long I have lived and studied the stars, for we centaurs live longer than you men, and even longer than your kind, Unicorn. Never in all my days have I seen such terrible things written in the skies as they have been nightly since this year began. The stars say nothing of the coming of Aslan, nor of peace, nor of joy. I know by my art that there have not been such disastrous conjunctions of the planets for 500 years. It was already on my mind to come and warn your majesty that some great evil hangs over Narnia, but last night the rumour reached me that Aslan is abroad in Narnia. Sire, do not believe this tale, it cannot be. The stars never lie, but men and beasts do. If Aslan were really coming to Narnia, the sky would have foretold it. If he were really come, all the most gracious stars would be assembled in his honour. It is all a lie. A lie? What creature in Narnia or all the world would dare lie on such a matter? Without knowing it, he laid his hand on his sword hilt. That I know not, Lord King, but I know there are liars on earth. There are none among the stars. I wonder, said Jewel, whether Aslan might come, though all the stars foretold otherwise. He is not the slave of the stars, but their maker. Is it not said in all the old stories that he is not a tame lion? Yes, well said, Jewel. Those are the very words. Not a tame lion. It comes in many tales. Runwit had just raised his hand and was leaning forward to say something very earnestly to the king, when all 3 of them turned their heads to listen to a wailing sound that was quickly drawing nearer. The wood was so thick to the west of them that they could not see the newcomer yet, but they could soon hear the voice. Woe for my brothers and sisters! Woe for the holy trees! The woods are laid waste! The axe is loosed against us! We are being felled! Great trees are falling! With the last falling, the speaker came in sight. She was like a woman, but so tall that her head was on a level with the centaur's. Yet she looked like a tree, too. It is hard to explain if you've never seen a dryad, but quite unmistakable once you have. Something different in the colour, the voice, and the hair. King Tilion and the 2 beasts knew at once that she was a nymph of a beech tree. Justice, Lord King! Come to our aid! Protect your people! They are felling us in Lantern Waste!
40 great trunks of my brothers and sisters are already on the ground. What, lady? Felling Lantern Waste? Murdering the talking trees? The king leapt to his feet, drawing his sword. How dare they? Who dares it? By the mane of Aslan! The Dryad was shuddering as if in pain, shuddering time after time, as if under repeated blows. Then all at once she fell sideways, as suddenly as if both her feet had been cut from under her. For a second they saw her lying dead on the grass, and then she vanished. They knew what had happened. Her tree, miles away, had been cut down. For a moment the king's grief and anger was so great he could not speak. Then he said, "Come, friends, we must go up river and find the villains who have done this, with all the speed that we may, for I shall not leave one of them alive." "Sire, with a good will," said Jewel. But Runewit said, "Sire, be wary even in your just wrath. There are strange doings on foot. If there should be rebels in arms farther up the valley, we 3 are too few to meet them. If it would please you to wait inside while—" "I will not wait the 10th part of a second. But while Jewel and I go forward, do you gallop as hard as you may to Cape Aravel. Here is my ring for your token. Get me a score of men-at-arms, all well mounted, and a score of talking dogs, and 10 dwarfs, let them all be fell archers, and a leopard or so, and Stonefoot the giant. Bring them all, as quickly as you may, after us." "With a good will, sire." And he at once turned and galloped eastward down the valley. The king strode on at a great pace, sometimes muttering to himself, and sometimes clenching his fists. Jewel walked beside him, saying nothing. There was no sound between them but the faint jingle of a rich gold chain that hung round the unicorn's neck, and the noise of 2 feet and 4 hoofs. They soon reached the river, and turned up it where there was a grassy road. They had the water on their left and the forest on their right. Soon after that they came to the place where the ground grew rougher, and thick wood came down at the water's edge. The road, what there was of it, now ran on the southern bank, and they had to ford the river to reach it. It was up to Tyrion's armpits, but Jewel, who had 4 legs and was therefore steadier, kept on his right so as to break the force of the current, and Tyrion put his strong arm round the unicorn's strong neck, and they both got safely over. The king was still so angry that he hardly noticed the cold of the water, but of course he dried his sword very carefully on the shoulder of his cloak, which was the only dry part of him, as soon as they came to shore. They were now going westward with the river on their right and Lantern Waste straight ahead of them. They had not gone more than a mile when they stopped, and both spoke at the same moment. The king said, "What have we here?" And Jewel said, "Look!" "It is a raft," said King Tyrion. And so it was. 6 splendid tree trunks, all newly cut and newly lopped of their branches, had been lashed together to make a raft, and were gliding swiftly down the river. On the front of the raft was a water rat with a pole to steer it. "Hey, water rat, what are you about?" "Taking logs to sell to the Calormenes, sire," said the rat, touching his ear as he might have touched his cap if he had one. "Calormenes? What do you mean? Who gave orders for these trees to be felled?" The river flows so swiftly at that time of year that the raft had already glided past the king and Jewel. But the water rat looked back over his shoulder and shouted out, "The lion's orders, sire! Aslan himself!" He added something more, but they couldn't hear it. The king and Unicorn stared at one another, and both looked more frightened than they'd ever been in any battle. Aslan? Could it be true? Could he be felling the holy trees and murdering the dryads? Unless the dryads have all done something dreadfully wrong. But selling them to Calormenes? Is it possible? I don't know. He's not a tame lion. Well, we must go on and take the adventure that comes to us. It is the only thing left for us to do, sire." He did not see at the moment how foolish it was for the 2 of them to go on alone, nor did the king. They were too angry to think clearly. But much evil came of their rashness in the end. Suddenly the king leaned hard on his friend's neck and bowed his head. "Jewel, what lies before us? Horrible thoughts arise in my heart. If we had died before today, we should have been happy. Yes, we have lived too long. The worst thing in the world has come upon us." They stood like that for a minute or 2, and then went on. Before long they could hear the hack
hack, hack of axes falling on timber, for they could see nothing yet because there was a rise of the ground above them. When they had reached the top, they could see right into Lantern Waste itself, and the king's face turned white when he saw it. Right through the middle of that ancient forest where the trees of gold and silver had once grown, where a child from our world had once planted the tree of protection, a broad lane had already been opened. It was a hideous lane, like a raw gash in the land, full of muddy ruts where felled trees had been dragged down to the river. And there was a great crowd of people at work, and a cracking of whips, and horses tugging and straining as they dragged at the logs. The first thing that struck the king and the unicorn was that about half the people in the crowd were not talking beasts, but men. The next thing was that these men were not the fair-haired men of Narnia. They were dark, bearded men from Calormen, that great and cruel country that lies beyond Archenland, across the desert to the south. There was no reason, of course, why one would not meet a Calormen or two in Narnia, a merchant or an ambassador. There was peace between Narnia and Calormen in those days. But Tirian could not understand why there were so many of them, and why they were cutting down a Narnian forest. He grasped his sword tighter and rolled his cloak round his left arm. They came quickly down among the men. 2 Calormens were driving a horse which was harnessed to a log, and just as the king reached them, the log had got stuck in a bad muddy place.
"Get on, son of Sloth! Pull, you lazy pig!"
cried the Calormens, cracking their whips. The horse was already straining himself as hard as he could. His eyes were red, he was covered with foam.
"Work, lazy brute!"
As he spoke, he struck the horse savagely with his whip. It was then that the really dreadful thing happened. Up till now, Tirian had taken it for granted that the horses, which the Calormens were driving, were their own horses, dumb, witless animals like the horses of our world. And though he hated to see even a dumb horse overdriven, he was of course thinking more about the murder of the trees. It had never crossed his mind that anyone would dare to harness one of the free talking horses of Narnia, much less use a whip on it. But as that savage blow fell, the horse reared up and said, half screaming, "Fool and tyrant, do you not see? I am doing all I can." When Tirian knew that the horse was one of his own Narnians, there came over him and over Jewel such a rage that they did not know what they were doing. The king's sword went up, the unicorn's horn went down. They rushed forward together. Next moment both the Calormens lay dead, the one beheaded by Tirian's sword, the other gored through the heart by Jewel's horn. The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 3. The Ape in its Glory.
Master Horse, said Tirian as he hastily cut its traces. "How come these aliens to enslave you? Is Narnia conquered? Has there been a battle?"
"No, sire. Aslan is here. It is all by his orders. He has commanded."
"Where danger, king?" said Jewel. Tirian looked up and saw that the Calormens, mixed with a few talking beasts, were beginning to run towards them from every direction. The 2 dead men had died without a cry, and so it had taken a moment or so before the rest of the crowd knew what had happened. But now they did. Most of them had naked scimitars in their hands. "Quick, on my back, sire!" The king flung himself astride his old friend, who turned and galloped away. He changed direction twice or thrice as soon as they were out of sight of their enemies, and crossed the stream, and shouted, without slackening his pace, "Whither way, sire? To Cair Paravel? Hold hard, friend. Let me off." No. He slid off the unicorn's back and faced him. "Jewel, we have done a dreadful deed. We were sorely provoked, but to leap on them unawares, without defying them, while they were unarmed. Ha! We are 2 murderers, Jewel. I am dishonoured for ever." Jewel dropped his head. He too was ashamed. "And then again the horse said it was by Aslan's orders. The rat said the same.
They all say Aslan is here. How if it were true? But, sire, how could Aslan be commanding such dreadful things? He is not a tame lion. How should we know what he would do? We who are murderers. Jewel, I will go back. I will give up my sword, and I will put myself in the hands of the Calormenes, and I shall ask that they bring me before Aslan, and let him do justice on me. You will go to your death, then, sire? Do you think I care if Aslan dooms me to death? That would be nothing. Nothing at all. Would it not be better to be dead, and to have this horrible fear that Aslan has come, and is not like the Aslan we have believed in and longed for? It is as if the sun rose one day, and were a black sun. I know. Or if you drank water and it was dry water. You are right, sire. This is the end of all things. Let us go and give ourselves up. There is no need for us both to go. If ever we loved one another, let me go with you now. If you are dead, and if Aslan is not Aslan, what life is left for me? They turned and walked back together, shedding bitter tears. As soon as they came to the place where the work was going on, the Calormenes raised a cry and came towards them with weapons in hand. But the king held out his sword with the hilt towards them. I, who was king of Narnia, and am now a dishonoured knight, give myself up to the justice of Aslan. Bring me before him. And I give myself up too, said Jewel. Then the dark men came round them in a thick crowd, smelling of garlic and onions, their white eyes flashing dreadfully in their brown faces. They put a rope halter round Jewel's neck, and they took the king's sword away and tied his hands behind his back. One of the Calormenes, who had a helmet instead of a turban and seemed to be in command, snatched the gold circlet off Tyrion's head and hastily put it away somewhere among his clothes. They led the two prisoners uphill to a place where there was a big clearing, and this was what the prisoners saw. At the centre of the clearing, which was also the highest point of the hill, there was a little hut, like a stable, with a thatched roof. The door was shut. On the grass in front of the hut there sat an ape. Tyrion and Jewel, who had been expecting to see Aslan and had heard nothing about an ape yet, were very bewildered when they saw it. The ape was, of course, Shift himself, but he looked 10 times uglier than when he'd lived by Cauldron Pool, for he was now dressed up. He was wearing a scarlet jacket, which did not fit him very well, having been made for a dwarf, and he had jewelled slippers on his hind paws, which would not stay on properly, because, as you know, the hind paws of an ape are really like hands. He wore what seemed to be a paper crown on his head. There was a great pile of nuts beside him, and he kept cracking nuts with his jaws and spitting out the shells. And he also kept on pulling up the scarlet jacket to scratch himself. A great number of talking beasts stood facing him. Nearly every face in that crowd looked miserably worried and bewildered. When they saw who the prisoners were, they all groaned and whimpered.
"O Lord Shift, mouthpiece of Aslan," said the chief Calormen, "we bring you prisoners. By our skill and courage, and by the permission of the great god Tash, we have taken alive these 2 desperate murderers."
"Give me that man's sword," said the ape.
So they took the king's sword, and handed it, with the sword belt and all, to the monkey, and he hung it round his neck, and it made him look sillier than ever.
"We'll see about those 2 later,"
said the ape, spitting out a shell in the direction of the 2 prisoners.
"I got some other business first. They can wait. Now, listen to me, everyone. The first thing I want to say is about nuts. Where's that head squirrel got to?"
"Yes, sir," said a red squirrel, coming forward and making a nervous little bow.
"Oh, you are you?"
said the ape with a nasty look.
"Now, attend to me. Aslan wants some more nuts. These you brought aren't anything like enough. You must bring some more, do you hear? Twice as many. They all got to be here by sunset tomorrow, and there must not be any bad ones or small ones among them."
A murmur of dismay ran through the other squirrels. The head squirrel plucked up courage to say, "Please, would Aslan himself speak to us about it, if we might be allowed to see him?"
"Well, you won't. He may be very kind, though it's a lot more than most of you deserve, and come out for a few minutes tonight, and then you can all have a look at him. But he will not have you crowding round him and pestering him with questions. Anything you want to say to him will be passed on through me, if I think it is worth bothering him about." In the meantime, all you squirrels had better go and see about the nuts, and make sure they are here by tomorrow evening. Oh, my word, you'll catch it!" The poor squirrels all scampered away, as if a dog were after them. This new order was terrible news for them. The nuts they'd carefully hoarded for the winter had nearly all been eaten by now, and of the few that were left, they'd already given the ape far more than they could spare. Then a deep voice, it belonged to a great tusked and shaggy boar, spoke from another part of the crowd.
"But why can't we see Aslan properly and talk to him? When he used to appear in Narnia in the old days, everyone could talk to him face to face."
"Don't you believe it? And even if it was true, times have changed. Aslan says he's been too soft with you before, do you see? And he is not going to be soft any more. He's going to lick you into shape this time. He'll teach you to think he's a tame lion." A low moaning and whimpering was heard among the beasts, and after that a dead silence, which was more miserable still. "And now there's another thing you have to learn. I hear some of you saying I'm an ape. Well, I am not. I am a man. And if I look like an ape, it is because I'm so very old, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And it's because I'm so old I'm so wise. And it's because I'm so wise I'm the only one Aslan is ever going to speak to. He can't be bothered talking to a lot of stupid animals. He'll tell me what you've got to do, and I'll tell the rest of you. And take my advice and see you do it in double quick time. He doesn't mean to stand any nonsense." There was dead silence, except for the noise of a very young badger crying, and its mother trying to make it keep quiet. "Now here's another thing," the ape went on, fitting a fresh nut into its cheek. "I hear some of the horses are saying, 'Let's hurry up now and get on with the job of carting this timber as quickly as we can, and then we'll be free again.' Well, you can get that idea out of your heads at once. And not only the horses either. Everybody who can work is going to be made to work in future. Aslan has settled it with the King of Calormen, the Tisroc, as our dark-faced friends call him. All you horses and bulls and donkeys are to be sent down into Calormen to work for your living, pulling and carrying the way horses and such like do in other countries. And all you digging animals like moles and rabbits and dwarfs, you are going down to work in the Tisroc's mines." "No, no, no," howled the beasts. "It can't be true. Aslan would never sell us into slavery to the King of Calormen." "None of that! Hold your noise! Who said anything about slavery? You won't be slaves. You will be paid. Very good wages, too. That is to say, your pay will be paid into Aslan's treasury, and he will use it for everybody's good." Then he glanced and almost winked at the chief Calormen. The Calormen bowed and replied in the pompous way Calormens have. "Most sapient mouthpiece of Aslan, the Tisroc, may he live forever, is wholly of one mind with your lordship in this judicious plan." "There, you see, it's all arranged, and all for your own good. We'll be able, with the money you earn, to make Narnia a country worth living in. There'll be oranges and bananas pouring in, and roads and big cities and schools and offices and whips and muzzles and saddles and cages and kennels and prisons. Everything."
"But we don't want all those things,"
said an old bear.
"We want to be free. We want to hear Aslan speak himself."
"Now don't you start arguing. It's a thing I won't stand. I am a man. You are only a fat, stupid old bear. What do you know about freedom? You think freedom means doing what you like. You're wrong. That is not true freedom. True freedom means doing what I tell you." Huh? The bear found this very hard to understand. "Please," said the high voice of a woolly lamb, who was so young that everyone was surprised he dared speak at all. "What's it now? Be quick." "Please, I can't understand. What have we to do with the Calormens? We belong to Aslan. They belong to Tash. They have a god called Tash. They say he's 4 arms and the head of a vulture. They kill men on his altar. I don't believe there is any such person as Tash, but if there was, how could Aslan be friends with him?"
All the animals cocked their heads sideways, and all their bright eyes flashed towards the ape. They knew it was the best question anyone had asked yet. The ape jumped up and spat at the lamb.
"Baby! Silly little bleater! Go home to your mother and drink milk! What do you understand of such things? But you others, listen. Tash is only another name for Aslan. Huh? All the old idea of us being right and the Calormens being wrong? Silly! We know better now. The Calormens use different words, but we all mean the same thing. Tash and Aslan are only two different names for you-know-who. That's why there can never be any quarrel between them. Get that into your heads, you stupid brutes. Tash is Aslan. Aslan is Tash.
You know how sad your own dog's face can look sometimes. Think of that. Then think of all the faces of those talking beasts. All those honest, humble, bewildered birds, bears, badgers, rabbits, moles and mice. All far sadder than that. Every tail was down, every whisker drooped. It would have broken your heart with very pity to see their faces. There was only one who did not look at all unhappy. It was a ginger cat, a great big Tom in the prime of life, who sat bolt upright with his tail curled round his toes in the very front row of all the beasts. He'd been staring hard at the ape and the Calormen captain all the time, and had never once blinked his eyes. "Excuse me," said the cat very politely, "but this interests me. Does your friend from Calormen say the same?"
"Assuredly. The enlightened man is in the right. Aslan means neither less nor more than Tash."
"Especially Aslan means no more than Tash."
"No more at all,"
said the Calormen, looking the cat straight in the face.
"Is that good enough for you, Ginger?"
said the ape. "Oh, certainly," said Ginger coolly. "Thank you so much. I only wanted to be quite clear. I think I am beginning to understand." Up till now, the king and Jewel had said nothing. They had been waiting until the ape should bid them speak, for they thought it was no use interrupting. But now, as Tilion looked round the miserable faces of the Narnians and saw how they would all believe that Aslan and Tash were one and the same, he could bear it no longer.
"Ape, you lie! You lie damnably! You lie like a Calormen, and you lie like an ape!"
He meant to go on, and ask how the terrible god Tash, who fed on the blood of his people, could possibly be the same as the good lion by whose blood all Narnia was saved. If he'd been allowed to speak, the rule of the ape might have ended that day. The beasts might have seen the truth and thrown the ape down. But before he could say another word, two Calormen struck him in the mouth with all their force, and a third from behind kicked his feet from under him. And as he fell, the ape squealed in rage and terror.
"Take him away! Take him away! Take him where he cannot hear us, nor we hear him! There, tie him to a tree! Aslan will do justice to him later."
Chapter 4. What happened that night? The king was so dizzy from being knocked down that he hardly knew what was happening, until the Calormens untied his wrists and put his hands straight down by his sides and set him with his back against an ash tree. Then they bound ropes round his ankles and his knees, and his waist and his chest, and they left him there. What worried him worst at the moment, for it is often little things that are hardest to stand, was that his lip was bleeding where they had hit him, and he could not wipe the little trickle of blood away, though it tickled him. From where he was, he could still see the little stable on the top of the hill, and the ape sitting in front of it. He could just hear the ape's voice still going on, and every now and then some answer from the crowd, but he could not make out the words. "I wonder what they've done to Jewel." Presently the crowd of beasts broke up and began going away in different directions. Some passed close to Tilion. They looked at him as if they were both frightened and sorry to see him tied up, but none of them spoke. Soon they'd all gone, and there was silence in the wood. Then hours and hours went past, and Tilion became first very thirsty, and then very hungry, and as the afternoon dragged on and turned into evening, he became cold too. His back was very sore. The sun went down, and it began to be twilight. When it was almost dark, Tilion heard a light pitter-patter of feet, and saw some creatures coming towards him. The three on the left were mice, and there was a rabbit in the middle. On the right were two moles. Both were carrying little bags on their backs, which gave him a curious look in the dark, so that at first he wondered what kind of beasts they were. Then in a moment they were all standing up on their hind legs, laying their cool paws on his knees, and giving his knees snuffly animal kisses. They could reach his knees, because Narnian talking beasts of a sort that are bigger than the dumb beasts of the same kind in England.
"Lord King, dear Lord King," said their shrill voices, "we are so sorry for you. We daren't untie you because Aslan might be angry with us, but we've brought you some supper." At once the first mouse climbed nimbly up till he perched on the rope that bound Tilion's chest, and was wriggling his blunt nose just in front of Tilion's face. Then the second mouse climbed up and hung on just below the first mouse, and the other beasts stood on the ground and began handing things up.
"Drink, sire. You'll find you are able to eat then."
Tilion found that a little wooden cup was being held to his lips. It was only the size of an egg cup, so he hardly tasted the wine in it before it was empty. But then the mouse passed it down, and it was refilled and passed back up again, and Tilion emptied it a second time. In this way they went on till he'd had quite a good drink, which was all the better for coming in little doses, for that is more thirst-quenching than one long draught.
"Here is cheese, sire. Not very much, for fear it will make you more thirsty."
And after the cheese they fed him with oat cakes and fresh butter, and then with some more wine.
"Now hand up the water," said the first mouse. "I will wash the king's face. There is blood on it."
Then Tilion felt something like a tiny sponge dabbing his face. It was most refreshing. "Little friends, how can I thank you for all this?"
You needn't. What else could we do? We don't want any other king. We're your people. If it was only the ape and the Calormans who were against you, we would have fought till we were cut to pieces. We would indeed. But we can't go against Aslan."
"Do you think it really is Aslan?"
"Oh, yes, said the rabbit. "He came out of the stable last night. We all saw him."
"What was he like?"
"Like a terrible great lion, to be sure."
"And do you think it is really Aslan who is killing the wood nymphs and making you slaves of the king of Calormen?"
"Ah, that's bad, isn't it? It would have been better if we died before all this began. But there's no doubt about it. Everyone says it is Aslan's orders, and we've seen him. Didn't think Aslan would be like that. We wanted him to come to Narnia. He seems to have come back very angry this time. We must have all done something really dreadfully wrong without knowing it. He must be punishing us for something. But I do think he might have told us what. I suppose what we're doing now may be wrong. I don't care. I'll do it again."
The others said, "Hush, do be careful." And then they all said, "We are sorry, dear king, but we must go back now. It would never do for us to be caught here. Oh, leave me at once, dear beasts. I would not for all Narnia bring you into danger." Good night, said the beasts, rubbing their noses against his knees. "We will come back, if we can." Then they all pattered away, and the wood seemed darker and colder and lonelier than it had before they came. The stars came out, and time went slowly on. Imagine how slowly, while the last king of Narnia stood stiff and sore and upright against the tree in his bonds. But at last something happened. Far away there appeared a red light. Then it disappeared for a moment, but came back again, bigger and stronger. Then he could see dark shapes going to and fro on this side of the light, and carrying bundles and throwing them down. He knew now what he was looking at. It was a bonfire, newly lit, and people were throwing bundles of brushwood onto it. Presently it blazed up, and Tilion could see that it was on the very top of the hill. He could see quite clearly the stable behind it, all lit up in the red glow, and a great crowd of beasts and men between the fire and himself. A small figure hunched up beside the fire must be the ape. It was saying something to the crowd, but he could not hear what. Then it went and bowed 3 times to the ground in front of the stable. Then it got up and opened the door, and something on 4 legs, something that walked rather stiffly, came out of the stable and stood facing the crowd. A great wailing or howling went up, so loud that Tirian could hear some of the words. "Aslan, Aslan, Aslan," cried the beasts. "Speak to us, comfort us, be angry with us no more." From where Tirian was, he could not make out very clearly what the thing was, but he could see that it was yellow and hairy. He had never seen the great lion. He had never even seen a common lion. He couldn't be sure that what he saw was not the real Aslan. He had not expected Aslan to look like that stiff thing which stood and said nothing, but how could he be sure? For a moment, horrible thoughts went through his mind. Then he remembered the nonsense about Tash and Aslan being the same. He knew then the whole thing must be a cheat. The ape put his head down towards the yellow thing's head, as if he were listening to something it was whispering to him. Then he turned and spoke to the crowd, and the crowd wailed again. Then the yellow thing turned clumsily round and walked, you might almost say waddled, back into the stable, and the ape shut the door behind it. After that the fire must have been put out, for the light vanished quite suddenly, and Tirian was once more alone with the cold and the darkness. He thought of other kings who had lived and died in Narnia in old times, and it seemed to him that none of them had ever been so unlucky as himself. He thought of his great-grandfather's great-grandfather, King Rilian, who had been stolen away by a witch when he was only a young prince, and kept hidden for years in the dark caves beneath the land of the northern giants. But then it had all come right in the end, for two mysterious children had suddenly appeared from the land beyond the world's end, and had rescued him, so that he came home to Narnia and had a long and prosperous reign. It is not like that with me. Then he went farther back, and thought about Rilian's father, Caspian the seafarer, whose wicked uncle King Myraz had tried to murder him, and how Caspian had fled into the woods and lived among the dwarfs. But this story too had all come right in the end, for Caspian also had been helped by children, only there were 4 of them that time, who came from somewhere beyond the world and fought a great battle and set him on his father's throne. But it was all so long ago. That sort of thing doesn't happen now. And then he remembered, for he'd always been good at history when he was a boy, how those same 4 children who had helped Caspian had been in Narnia over 1,000 years before, and it was then that they had done the most remarkable thing of all, for they had defeated the terrible White Witch and ended the 100 years of winter. And after that they had reigned, all 4 of them together, at Cape Haravel, till they were no longer children, but great kings and lovely queens, and their reign had been the golden age of Narnia. And Aslan had come into that story a lot. He'd come into all the other stories too, as Tirian now remembered. Aslan and the children from another world, thought Tirian. They have always come in when things were at their worst. Oh, if only they could come now! And he called out, "Aslan! Aslan! Aslan! Come and help us now!" But the darkness and the cold and the quietness went on just the same. "Let me be killed! I ask nothing for myself, but come and save all Narnia!" And still there was no change in the night or the wood. But there began to be a kind of change inside Tirian. Without knowing why, he began to feel a faint hope, and he felt somehow stronger. Oh, Aslan, Aslan, if you will not come yourself, at least send me the helpers from beyond the world, or let me call them, let my voice carry beyond this world. Then, hardly knowing he was doing it, he suddenly cried out in a great voice, "Children! Children! Friends of Narnia! Quick! Come to me! Come across the worlds, I call you! I, Tirian, King of Narnia, Lord of Cape Haravel, and Emperor of the Lone Islands!" And immediately he was plunged into a dream, if it was a dream, more vivid than he'd ever had in his life. He seemed to be standing in a lighted room, where 7 people sat round a table. It looked as if they had just finished a meal. 2 of these people were very old, an old man with a white beard, and an old woman with wise, merry, twinkling eyes. He who sat at the right hand of the old man was hardly full-grown, certainly younger than Tyrion himself, but his face already had the look of a king and a warrior, and you could almost say the same of the other youth who sat at the right hand of the old woman. Facing Tyrion across the table sat a fair-haired girl, younger than either of these, and on either side of her a boy and a girl who were younger still. They were all dressed in what seemed to Tyrion the oddest kind of clothes. But he had no time to think about details like that, for instantly the youngest boy and both girls started to their feet. One of them gave a little scream. The old woman started and drew in her breath. The old man must have made some sudden movement too, for the wine-glass which stood at his right hand was swept off the table. Tyrion could hear the tinkling noise as it broke on the floor. Then Tyrion realized that these people could see him. They were staring at him as if they saw a ghost. But he noticed that the king-like one, who sat at the old man's right, never moved, though he turned pale, except that he clenched his hand very tight. Then he said, "Speak, if you're not a phantom or a dream. You have a Narnian look about you, and we are the 7 friends of Narnia." Tyrion was longing to speak, and tried to cry out aloud that he was Tyrion of Narnia, in great need of help. But he found, as I have sometimes found in dreams too, that his voice made no noise at all. The one who had already spoken to him rose to his feet. "Shadow, or spirit, or whatever you are, if you are from Narnia, I charge you in the name of Aslan to speak to me. I am Peter, the High King." The room began to swim before Tyrion's eyes. He heard the voices of those 7 people all speak at once. All got fainter and fainter every second. They were saying things like, "Look, it's fading, it's melting away, it's vanishing." Next moment he was wide awake, still tied to the tree, colder and stiffer than ever. The wood was full of the pale, dreary light that comes before sunrise, and he was soaking wet with dew. It was early morning. Waking was about the worst moment he had ever had in his life. The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 5. How Help Came to the King. But his misery did not last long. Almost at once there came a bump, and then a second bump, and 2 children were standing before him. The wood in front of him had been quite empty a second or so before, and he knew it had not come from behind the tree, for he would have heard them. They had in fact simply appeared from nowhere. He saw at a glance that they were wearing the same queer, dingy sorts of clothes as the people in his dream, and he saw at a second glance that they were the youngest boy and girl out of a party of 7. "Gosh," said the boy, "that took one's breath away. I thought—" "Hurry up and get him untied," said the girl. "We can talk afterwards." Then she added, turning to Tyrion, "I'm sorry we've been so long. We came the moment we could." While she was speaking, the boy had produced a knife from his pocket and was quickly cutting the king's bonds. Too quickly, in fact, for the king was so stiff and numb that when the last cord was cut he fell forward on his hands and knees. He couldn't get up again till he'd brought some life back into his legs by a good rubbing. "I say," said the girl, "it was you, wasn't it, who appeared to us that night when we were all at supper, nearly a week ago?" "A week, fair maid? My dream led me into your world scarce 10 minutes since." "It's the usual muddle about times, Pole," said the boy. "I remember now," said Tyrion. "That comes in all the old tales. The time of your strange land is different from ours. But if we speak of time, 'tis time to be gone from here, for my enemies are close at hand. Will you come with me?" "Of course. It's you we've come to help." Tyrion got to his feet and led them rapidly downhill, southward, away from the stable. He knew well where he meant to go, but his first aim was to get rocky places where they would leave no trail. His second was to cross some water so that they would leave no scent. This took about an hour's scrambling and wading, and while that was going on nobody had any breath to talk. But even so, Tyrion kept on stealing glances at his companions. The wonder of walking beside the creatures from another world made him feel dizzy, but it also made all the old stories seem far more real than they'd ever seemed before. It seemed anything might happen now. "Now," said Tyrion, as they came to the head of a little valley which ran down before them among young birch trees, "we are out of danger of those villains for a space, and we may walk more easily." The sun had risen, dewdrops were twinkling on every branch, and birds were singing. "What about some grub? For you, sir. We too have had our breakfast," said the boy. Tyrion wondered what he meant by grub, but when the boy opened a bulgy satchel which he was carrying and pulled out a rather greasy and squashy packet, he understood. He was ravenously hungry, though he hadn't thought about food until now. There were 2 hard-boiled egg sandwiches and 2 cheese sandwiches, and 2 with some kind of paste in them. If he hadn't been so hungry, he wouldn't have thought much of a paste, for that is not the sort of food anybody eats in Narnia. But by the time he'd eaten all 6 sandwiches, they'd come to the bottom of a valley, and there they found a mossy cliff with a little fountain bubbling out of it. All 3 stopped and drank and splashed their hot faces. "And now," said the girl, as she tossed her wet hair back from her forehead, "aren't you going to tell us who you are, and why you were tied up, and what it's all about?" "With a good will, damson. But we must keep on the march." So while they went on walking, he told them who he was and all the things that had happened. "Now, I'm going to a certain tower, one of 3 that were built in my grandsire's time to guard Lantern Waste against certain perilous outlaws who dwelled there in that day. By Aslan's good will I was not robbed of my keys, and in that tower we shall find store of weapons and mail and some victuals, though no better than dry biscuit. There we can lie safe and make our plans. And now, prithee, tell me who you 2 are, and all your story." "I'm Eustace Scrubb, and this is Jill Pole. We were here once before, ages and ages ago. More than a year by our time. There was a chap called Prince Rilian then. They were keeping him underground. Puddleglum put his foot in—"
"Oh, no, you are that Eustace, then, and that Jill who rescued King Rilian from his long enchantment." "Yes, that's us. He's King Rilian now, is he?" "Oh, well, I suppose he must be. I forgot."
"No, nay. I am the 7th in descent from him. He has been dead over 200 years.
"Oh, that's the horrid thing about coming back to Narnia."
"Well, now you know who we are, sire, and it was like this. The Professor and Aunt Polly got all us friends of Narnia together. I know not these names, Eustace. Well, they're the 2 came into Narnia at the very beginning, the day all the animals learned to talk."
"By the lion's mane, those 2? The Lord Diggory and the Lady Polly? From the dawn of the world, they are alive still in your place? The wonder and the glory of it!"
"Well, she isn't our real aunt, you know. She's Miss Plummer, but we call her Aunt Polly. Well, anyway, they got us together, those 2, partly just for fun, so we could all have a good jaw about Narnia, for of course there's no one else we can ever talk to about things like that, but partly because the Professor had a feeling that we were somehow wanted over here. And then you came like a ghost, or goodness knows what, and nearly frightened the lives out of us. Then you vanished without saying a word. After that we knew for certain something was up, so the next question was how to get here. You can't go just by wanting to, so we talked and talked, and at last the Professor said the only way would be by the magic rings. It was by these rings that he and Aunt Polly got here long ago, when they were only kids, years before we younger ones were born. But the rings had all been buried in the garden of a house in London. That's our big town, sire. And the house had been sold. So then the problem was how to get at them. You'll never guess what we did in the end. Peter and Edmund, that's the High King Peter, the one who spoke to you, well, they went up to London to get into the garden from the back early in the morning before people were up. They dressed themselves like workmen, so if anyone did see them, it would look as if they'd come to do something about the drains. I wish I'd been with them. It must have been glorious fun. And they must have succeeded, for next day Peter sent us a wire. Oh, that's like a sort of message, sire. I'll explain about it some other time. And it said that he'd got the rings. And the day after that was the day Pole and I had to go back to school. We're the only 2 still at school, and we're at the same one. So Peter and Edmund were to meet us at a place on the way down to school and hand over the rings. It had to be us 2 who went back to Narnia, you see, because the older ones couldn't come again. So we got into the train. That's the kind of thing people travel in our world. A lot of wagons chained together. and the Professor and Aunt Polly and Lucy came with us, and we all wanted to keep together, you see, for as long as we could. Well, there we were in the train, and we were just getting to the station where the others were to meet us, and I was looking out of the window to see if I could see them, when suddenly there came a most frightful jerk and a noise, and then we were in Narnia, and there was your Majesty tied to the tree." "So you never used the rings?" "No, never even saw them. Aslan did it all for us in his own way, without any rings." "But the High King Peter has them." "Yes, but we don't think he can use them. When the two Pevensies, King Edmund and Queen Lucy, were last here, Aslan said that they would never come back again to Narnia. He said something of the same sort to the High King. That was longer ago. You may be sure he'd come like a shot if he was allowed." "Gosh," said Eustace, "it's getting hot in this sun. Are we nearly there, sire?" "Look," said Tyrion, and pointed. Not many yards away, grey battlements rose over the treetops, and after a minute's more walking they came out into an open grassy space. A stream ran across it, and on the far side of the stream stood a squat square tower, with very few and narrow windows and one heavy-looking door in the wall that faced them. Tyrion looked sharply this way and that to make sure no enemies were in sight. Then he walked up to the tower and stood still for a moment, fishing up his bunch of keys. He had these inside his hunting dress on the narrow silver chain that went round his neck. It was a nice bunch of keys that he brought out, for 2 were golden and many were richly ornamented. You could see at once they were keys made for opening solemn and secret rooms in palaces, or chests and caskets of sweet-smelling wood that contained royal treasures. But the key which he now put into the lock of the door was big and plain and more rudely made. The lock was stiff, and for a moment Tyrion began to be afraid that it would not turn. But at last it did, and the door swung open with a sullen creak. "Welcome, friends. I fear this is the best palace that the King of Narnia can now offer to his guests." Tyrion was pleased to see the 2 strangers had been well brought up. They both said not to mention it, and that they were sure it would be very nice. As a matter of fact, it was not particularly nice. It was rather dark and smelled very damp. There was only one room in it, and this room went right up to the stone roof. A wooden staircase in one corner led up to a trap-door by which you could go out onto the battlements. There were a few rude bunks to sleep in, and a great many lockers and bundles. There was also a hearth, which looked as if nobody had lit a fire in it for a great many years. "We'd better go out and gather some firewood first thing, hadn't we?" said Jill. "Not yet, comrade." Tyrion was determined that they should not be caught unarmed, and began searching the lockers, thankfully remembering that he had always been careful to have these garrison towers inspected once a year, and to make sure they were stocked with all things needful. The bowstrings were there in their coverings of oiled silk, the swords and spears were greased against rust, and the armour was kept bright in its wrappings. But there was something even better. "Look you," said Tyrion, as he drew out a long mail shirt of a curious pattern and flashed it before the children's eyes. "That's a funny-looking mail, sire." "Aye, lad, it is. No Narnian dwarf smithied this. 'Tis the mail of Calormen. Outlandish gear. I have ever kept a few suits of it in readiness, for I never knew when I or my friends might have reason to walk unseen in the Tisrock's land. And look on this stone bottle. In this there is a juice which, when we have rubbed it on our hands and faces, will make us as brown as Calormenes." "Oh, rah!" said Jill. "Disguise! I love disguises." Tyrion showed them how to pour out a little of the juice into the palms of their hands, and then rub it well over their faces and necks, right down to the shoulders, and then on their hands and right up to the elbows. He did the same himself. "After this has hardened on us, we may wash in water, and it will not change. Nothing but oil and ashes will make us Narnians again. Now, sweet Jill, let us go and see how this mail shirt becomes you. 'Tis something too long, yet not so much as I feared. Doubtless it belonged to a page in the train of one of their Tarkans." After the mail shirts they put on Calormene helmets, which were little round things fitting tight to the head and having a spike on top. Then Tyrion took long rolls of some white stuff out of a locker and wound them over his helmets till they became turbans. But the little steel spike still stuck up in the middle. He and Eustace took curved Calormene swords and little round shields. There was no sword light enough for Jill, but he gave her a long, straight hunting knife, which might do for a sword at a pinch. "Hast thou any skill with the bow, maiden?" "Nothing worth talking of. Scrub's not bad." "Don't believe her, sire. We've both been practising archery since we got back from Narnia last time. She's almost as good as me now. Not that either of us is much good." Then Tyrion gave Jill a bow and a quiver full of arrows. The next business was to light a fire, for inside that tower it still felt more like a cave than like anything indoors, and set one shivering. But they got warm gathering wood, and the sun was now at its highest, and when once the blaze was roaring up the chimney, the place began to look cheerful. Dinner was, however, a dull meal, for the best they could do was to pound up some of the hard biscuit which they found in a locker, and pour it into boiling water with salt, so as to make some kind of porridge. And of course there was nothing to drink but water. "I wish we'd brought a packet of tea, or a tin of cocoa. A firkin or so of good wine in each of these towers would not have been amiss," said Tyrion. Chapter 6. A Good Night's Work. About 4 hours later, Tyrion flung himself into one of the bunks to snatch a little sleep. The 2 children were already snoring. He had made them go to bed before he did, because they would have to be up most of the night, and he knew that at their age they could not do this without sleep. Also, he had tired them out. First he'd given Jill some practice in archery, and found that, though not up to Narnian standards, she really was not too bad. Indeed, she'd succeeded in shooting a rabbit, not a talking rabbit, of course. There are lots of the ordinary kind in Western Narnia, and it was already skinned, cleaned, and hanging up. He had found that both children knew all about this chilly and smelly job. They had learned that kind of thing on their great journey through Giant Land in the days of Prince Rilian. Then he had tried to teach Eustace how to use his sword and shield. Eustace had learned a lot about sword fighting on his earlier adventures, but that had been all of a straight Narnian sword. He'd never handled a curved Calormian scimitar. It made it hard. Many of the strokes were quite different, and some of the habits he'd learned with a long sword now had to be unlearned. But Tyrion found he had a good eye and was very quick on his feet. He was surprised at the strength of both the children. In fact, they both seemed already much stronger and bigger and more grown up than they'd been when he first met them a few hours ago. That is one of the effects which Narnian air often has on visitors from our world. All 3 of them agreed that the very first thing they must do was go back to Stable Hill and try to rescue Jewel the Unicorn. After that, if they succeeded, they would try to get away eastward and meet the little army which Runeward the Centaur would be bringing from Cair Paravel. An experienced warrior and huntsman like Tyrion can always wake up at any time he wants, so he gave himself till 9 o'clock that night, then put all worries out of his head and fell asleep at once. It seemed only a moment later when he woke and knew by the light and the very feel of things that he'd timed his sleep exactly. He got up, put on his helmet and turban — he'd slept in the mail shirt — and then shook the other 2 till they woke. They looked, to tell the truth, very grey and dismal as they climbed out of their bunks, and there was a good deal of yawning. "Now, we go north from here, and by good fortune it is a starry night. It will be a much shorter journey than this morning, for then we went roundabout, but now we shall go straight. If we are challenged, you 2 hold your peace, and I will do my best to talk like a cursed, cruel, proud lord of Calormen. If I draw my sword, then thou, Eustace, must do likewise, and let Jill leap behind us and stand with an arrow on the string. But if I cry home, then fly for the tower, both of you, and let none try to fight on, not even one stroke, after I have given the retreat. Such false valour has spoiled many notable plans in the wars. And now, friends, in the name of Aslan, let us go forward." Out they went into the cold night. All the great northern stars were burning above the treetops. The North Star of that world is called the Spearhead. It is brighter than our pole star. For a time they went straight towards the Spearhead, but presently they came to a dense thicket, so they had to go out of their course to get round it. After that, for they were still overshadowed by branches, it was hard to pick up their bearings. It was Jill who set them right again, being an excellent guide in England, and of course she knew the Narnian stars perfectly, having travelled much in the northern wildlands. She could work out the direction from other stars, even when the Spearhead was hidden. As soon as Tyrion saw that she was the best pathfinder of the 3, he put her in front, and then he was astonished to find how silently and almost invisibly she glided on before them. By the May, this girl is a wondrous wood-maid. If she had dryad blood in her, she would scarce do it better. She's so small, that's what helps. "Shh!" said Jill. "Less noise!" All round them the wood was very quiet. Indeed, it was far too quiet. On an ordinary Narnian night there ought to have been noises, an occasional cheery good night from a hedgehog, the cry of an owl overhead, perhaps a flute in the distance to tell of fauns dancing, or some throbbing, hammering noises from dwarfs underground. All that was silenced. Gloom and fear reigned over Narnia. After a time, and the trees grew farther apart, Tyrion could dimly make out the well-known hilltop and the stable. Jill was now going with more and more caution. She kept on making signs to the others with her hand to do the same. Then she stopped dead still, and Tyrion saw her gradually sink down into the grass and disappear without a sound. A moment later she rose again, put her mouth close to Tyrion's ear, and said in the lowest possible whisper, "Get down. See better." She said "see" for "see," not because she had a lisp, but because she knew that the hissing letter S is the part of a whisper most likely to be overheard. Tyrion at once lay down, almost as silently as Jill, but not quite, for he was heavier and older. And once they were down, he saw from that position that you could see the edge of the hill sharp against the star-strewn sky. Two black shapes rose against it. One was the stable, and the other, a few feet in front of it, was a Calormene sentry. He was keeping very ill watch, not walking or even standing, but sitting with his spear over his shoulder and his chin on his chest. "Well done," said Tyrion to Jill. She had shown him exactly what he needed to know. They got up, and Tyrion now took the lead. Very slowly, hardly daring to breathe, they made their way up to a little clump of trees, which was not more than 40 feet from the sentinel. "Wait here till I come again. If I miscarry, fly." He sauntered out boldly in full view of the enemy. The man started when he saw him, was just going to jump to his feet. He was afraid Tyrion might be one of his own officers, and he would get into trouble for sitting down. But before he could get up, Tyrion had dropped on one knee beside him, saying, "Art thou a warrior of the Tisroc? May he live forever? It cheers my heart to meet thee among all these beasts and devils of Narnians. Give me thy hand, friend." Before he knew what was happening, the Calormene sentry found his right hand seized in a mighty grip. Next instant someone was kneeling on his legs, and a dagger was pressed against his neck. "One noise, and thou art dead. Tell me where the unicorn is, and thou shalt live."
Behind the stable, O my master."
"Good. Rise up, and lead me to him." As the man got up, the point of the dagger never left his neck. It only travelled round, cold and rather ticklish, as Tyrion got behind him, and settled it at a convenient place under his ear. Tremblingly he went round to the back of the stable. Though it was dark, Tyrion could see the white shape of Jewel at once. "Hush, do not neigh. Yes, Jewel, it is I. How have they tied thee?"
"Hobbled by all 4 legs, and tied with a bridle to a ring in the stable wall."
"Stand here, sentry, with your back to the wall. So. Now, Jewel, set the point of your horn against this Calormene's breast."
"With a good will, sire."
"If he moves, rive him to the heart." In a few seconds Tyrion had cut the ropes. With the remains of them he bound the sentry hand and foot, and finally he made him open his mouth, stuffed it full of grass, and tied him up from scalp to chin so that he could make no noise. He lowered the man into a sitting position and set him against the wall. "I have done thee some discourtesy, soldier, but such was my need. If we meet again, I may happen to do thee a better turn. Now, Jewel, let us go softly." He put his left arm round the beast's neck and bent and kissed its nose, and both had great joy. They went back as quietly as possible to the place where he had left the children. It was darker in there under the trees, and he nearly ran into Eustace before he saw him. "All is well. A good night's work. Now for home." They turned and went a few paces, when Eustace said, "Where are you, Pole?" "Is Jill the other side of you, sire?"
"What? Is she not on the other side of you?"
It was a terrible moment. They dared not shout, but they whispered her name in the loudest whispers they could manage. There was no reply.
"Did she go from you while I was away?" "I didn't see her. She could have gone without my knowing. She can be as quiet as a cat. You've seen that for yourself."
At that moment a far-off drumbeat was heard. Jewel moved his ears forward.
"Dwarfs."
"And treacherous dwarfs, enemies as likely as not."
"And here comes something on hoofs, much nearer," said Jewel.
The 2 humans and the unicorn stood dead still. There were now so many different things to worry about that they didn't know what to do. The noise of hoofs came steadily nearer, and then quite close to them a voice whispered,
"Hello, are you all there?"
Thank heavens it was Jill.
"Where the devil have you been?"
"In the stable," gasped Jill. It was the sort of gasp you give when you're struggling with suppressed laughter.
Oh, you think it's funny, do you? Well, all I can say is, have you got Jewel, sire? Yes, here he is. What is this beast with you? It's him. But let's be off home before anyone wakes up. Again there came little explosions of laughter. The others obeyed at once, for they had already lingered long enough in that dangerous place, and the dwarf drums seemed to have come a little nearer. It was only after they had been walking southward for several minutes that Eustace said, "Got him? What do you mean?" "The false Aslan." "What? Where have you been? What have you done?" "Well, sire, as soon as I saw that you'd got the sentry out of the way, I thought, hadn't I better have a look inside the stable, see what really is there? So I crawled along. It was as easy as anything to draw the bolt. Of course it was pitch black inside. It smelt like any other stable. I struck a light. Would you believe it? There was nothing in there at all but this old donkey with a bundle of lion skin tied on his back. So I drew my knife, and I told him he'd had to come along with me. As a matter of fact, I needn't have threatened him at all. He was very fed up with that stable, and quite ready to come with me. Weren't you, Puzzle, dear?" "Great Scott!" said Eustace. "Well, I'm jiggered. I was jolly angry with you a moment ago, and I still think it was mean of you to sneak off without the rest of us. But I must admit, well, what a perfectly gorgeous thing to do. If she was a boy, she'd have to be knighted, wouldn't she, sire?" "If she was a boy, she would be whipped for disobeying orders." In the dark, no one could see whether this was said with a frown or a smile. Next minute there was the sound of rasping metal. "What are you doing, sire?" asked Jewel sharply. "Drawing my sword to smite off the head of this accursed ass. Stand clear, girl." "No, you mustn't, don't. Really, you mustn't. It wasn't his fault. It was all the ape. He didn't know any better, and he's very sorry, and he's a nice donkey. His name's Puzzle, and I've got my arms round his neck." "Drill, you are the bravest and most woodwise of all my subjects, but you are also the most malapert and disobedient. Well, let the ass live. What have you to say for yourself, ass?"
"Me, sire? I'm sure I'm very sorry if I've done wrong. The ape said Aslan wanted me to dress up like that. I thought he'd know because I'm not clever like him, and I only did what I was told. It wasn't any fun living in that stable. I don't even know what's been going on outside. He never let me out except for a minute or two at night. Some days they forgot to give me water too."
"Sire," said Jewel, "those dwarfs are coming nearer and nearer. Do we want to meet them?" Tyrion thought for a moment, then suddenly gave a great laugh out loud. Then he spoke, not this time in a whisper. "By the lion, I am growing slow-witted. Meet them? Certainly we will meet them. We will meet anyone now. We have this ass to show them. Let them see the thing they have feared and bowed to. We can show them the truth of the ape's vile plot. His secret is out. The tide has turned. Tomorrow we shall hang that ape from the highest tree in Narnia. No more whispering and skulking in disguises. Where are these honest dwarfs? We have good news for them." When you've been whispering for hours, the mere sound of anyone talking out loud is a wonderfully stirring thing. The whole party began talking and laughing. Even Puzzle lifted up his head and gave a grand hee-hee-haw-haw hee-hee, thing the ape hadn't allowed him to do for days. Then they set off in the direction of the drumming. It grew steadily louder, and soon they could see torchlight as well. They came out on one of those rough roads, we'd hardly call them roads at all in England, which ran through Lantern Waste, and there, marching sturdily along, were about 30 dwarfs, all with their little spades and mattocks over their shoulders. 2 armed Calormenes led the column, and 2 more brought up the rear. "Stay, soldiers! Whither do you lead these Narnian dwarfs? And by whose orders?"